Thank you everyone for joining. Today we're going to talk about migrating data solutions to the cloud. And we'll talk through some different things to consider as you're looking at approaches and planning a migration of a data solution or a data platform to the cloud, whatever platform you're coming from. So we'll get into that in just a second. Let me introduce myself first and tell you a little bit about why I'm talking about this topic. So I'm Andrew Kennedy. I'm a business intelligence and analytics consultant with Thorogood. I've been working with Thorogood for a number of years, really since we started picking up cloud activities, cloud platforms, and I've worked with a number of customers on designing cloud platforms, architecting cloud platforms, and that's included both designing and building from scratch with some clients, and then with other clients migrating an existing solution. And we'll touch today on some of the things that we've thought through in those different scenarios. So as we talk that through, I'm going to take a few steps in the agenda. The first, we'll talk about understanding the benefits of the cloud and how to identify your goals within those benefits. The second thing we'll do is decide on a high-level approach and talk about, we'll use the example of two different clients that kind of set out different patterns for how a migration can look. And then I'll highlight a number of different factors to consider as you're putting together the actual plan for your migration. So first off, as we go to understand the benefits of a cloud migration, we're comparing from when you had your own data center in the office, most organizations probably having a couple of different data centers to provide resiliency, and moving to a pattern where everything is stored on the cloud, be that on one public cloud or perhaps two or three different cloud vendors. A pattern that we're seeing a lot is multi-cloud, and where multiple of the cloud vendors are being used in tandem to sometimes to provide that resiliency and to reduce the vendor lock-in. But whatever that migration looks like, there are various different things that people go into it looking for. There are various different benefits that organizations are trying to get out of that cloud migration. And typically, they'll fall into a number of different categories. So a key thing for a lot of clients is increasing innovation. We know that there's a wider tool set available, particularly if you're thinking about things like machine learning, IoT, data science, how do we build some of these new capabilities into our platforms. And so the cloud can unlock those really easily, and that's one of the reasons in increasing innovation. Also, by putting the data in some of the structures that you use in the cloud, it can make it easier to reuse data across multiple use cases. A second set of reasons is around optimizing overheads. Like I say, a number of organizations would have had multiple data centers in their own premises. And so by leveraging shared data centers, by using the cloud vendors and allowing them to do some of the management of that, you can reduce maintenance costs for your own organization. Another key thing is that there's typically a move from CapEx to OpEx. There can be discounts for committing over a longer period of time, but very often you'll move from kind of buying servers and buying racks up front to paying for what you're using as you go, or at least paying monthly costs. Like I said, maybe with some forward commitment, but it changes the cost structure. And for some organizations, that can be really beneficial in terms of how you're assigning costs and how you're thinking about spending. And then there's reducing risk. So from having potentially two or three key data centers in one part of your organization, with a move to the cloud, you can scale out to have a whole load of different data centers available, have backups in, for your most critical data, you could have backups in 3, 4, 5 different data centers at different levels of availability. And then obviously with that, you want to respond quickly to change. So not just in terms of responding if something goes wrong, but also when something changes in the business, by being in the cloud, by being able to change TAC, by being able to change what infrastructure we're using really quickly, it allows us to take advantage of business opportunities faster and develop faster alongside the business goals. With those ranges of benefits, different organizations will have different things within that come out as the top priority goals. So this is where I'm going to start talking a little bit about the two customer scenarios that we'll focus on as kind of the way that we approach this topic today. So client A, a regional office at a global consumer goods company. So this is one that was, they were the regional office responsible for the IT team there, the data team there, responsible for data platform for the whole region. So not just the country that they were sitting in, but also 4 or 5 other countries to different extents. So they had the entire data set for their own country. So that's finance data, customer purchasing patterns, production volumes, and so on. Really, we were looking at, for this for this project, we were looking at the key customer consumption patterns and customer purchase patterns across those different units. So they were doing that for all 5 units. And in their scenario, they were moving office and they wanted to reduce the need for on-prem infrastructure. In fact, not just reduce it, they wanted to eliminate the on-prem infrastructure. So they were moving entirely to the cloud, and they were doing that in line with an office move. So what are the priorities when you do that? First off, the old on-prem infrastructure has to be decommissioned. The new office they set up and spec'd out didn't have space for an infrastructure to sit there. So they had to completely decommission that old system and replace it. It also gave them a pretty hard deadline. The whole project had to be completed by the time they moved. Because of the way they were doing it, everything has to be migrated. You can't have reporting there one day and then you move office and suddenly a tenth of the reports is available. Whatever reporting was available before has to be available in the new system. And people need to have immediate confidence in it. So there's a set of priorities there in that migration. Some of those, so that decommissioning the on-prem system related to the cloud. Other aspects of it actually driven more by the circumstances surrounding the transition and surrounding the migration, rather than benefits of the cloud maybe per se. The second client that we'll take as the other example, again, a regional office of global consumer goods company. This one in a completely different part of the world. So client A was a European client, client B is in the Asia Pacific region. In this case, they had their entire data set for one country. But in particular, we were focused on sales data that gives visibility of the customer behavior in their case. So it's what are customers purchasing, and that data this time coming from the sales channel. So understanding what customers are purchasing in the shops and in the retailers. And so in both cases, we were looking at a set of reports that are being used by management, being used by really a whole range of business units across the organization. But right up to that management level, these reports need to function. In the case of client B, though, the reason they were moving was slightly different. They were moving because with all these high-level execs using the reporting, as well as the rest of the organization, there were some performance challenges as the data grew in scale. And so they needed to expand the platform capacity to cope with that so that their senior execs can access the financial reporting as fast as anyone else in the organization is able to access the sales reporting, and as fast as they've always been able to access it. So you can imagine the pressure that gives to the data teams. And they looked at increasing on-prem capacity, but between various aspects, that was going to take far longer than was acceptable. I think in their case, it was taking half a year or so to get a new server in place to try and extend the capacity that way. And so trying to get an on-prem server wasn't going to happen fast enough. And so that drove them to look at the cloud. And so what are their priorities? When we talked it through, it actually went a bit wider than that. So the first thing was to increase the capacity for key data sets. So in this case, we weren't actually being forced to move everything, so we can improve the capacity for the key data sets, while potentially still leaving some of the old stuff, at least in the short term, on premise. They wanted to create flexibility for future expansion and innovation, so thinking about what the organization is doing going forward. And another key aspect for them, they wanted to make sure that their IT and data teams were developing the skills alongside the migration. So that was something where we were able to help by working alongside them, helping them to understand what we were doing so that they were able to support the platform going into the future. So that, you'll see as we go through, that has some implications in terms of how the plan looks and how you choose to go about the migration as well. So two clients, in some ways very similar positions, very similar companies, and actually very similar data sets, but very different scenarios. One of them moving office and trying to move to the cloud to help as part of that office move. The other moving to the cloud really because they see the benefits around being able to scale it up, use larger capacity, and the flexibility that will give them into the future. So for you, whatever your organization is, whichever solution it is that you're looking at, there are going to be different goals. There are going to be different priorities within that. And whatever it is that you're looking for, it's key at the start of this process to get down what are the goals that you're going after, what are your priorities, and think through those and how those affect the way that you do the migration. And that really will be what drives your decision on a high-level approach. So again, stepping to client A and client B, in our first case, they're moving office, they need to do it quickly, they've got a hard deadline, and so we decided to replicate the existing system on cloud infrastructure. So where previously they had the data center, now it's going to sit in one of the cloud vendors. And so everything is going to be exactly the same, like for like. It will work on the next day. When they move office, the next day they maybe have to enter a different connection, or they get the new version of the Excel file, but it's going to look the same, it's going to feel the same, and it's all going to work exactly as it did before. To do that, we worked with the client to prioritize the workloads, to make sure that we're moving the most important and the ones that need the most testing first. But really, we moved everything on a very condensed timeline. I think it was somewhere around the 6-week mark that we had to migrate that platform across. So migrating all the historical data, migrating all the data loads, so that it keeps getting the new data in, and testing very thoroughly to get the like-for-like output between the systems. And so the key core message in that one was test and test and test, alongside moving things quickly. And because we were moving things with no changes other than the infrastructure it's sitting on being on-prem to cloud, we were able to do that fairly quickly, do the like-for-like testing between the two systems. They get the benefit of the data being in the cloud and having that, having the lower maintenance fees, because it's part of that is being managed by the cloud vendor. They have the advantage that data center is accessible from various places, and some of the backup capabilities that come with the platform. So there are some of the cloud benefits that they get, but really we were able to deliver that benefit really quickly and within their goals. In the case of Client B, because they were looking to create more flexibility, deliver more capacity, but also to drive business value and unlock innovation with what they were doing, we did something slightly different. In this case, rather than trying to move the whole thing at once and move it quickly, we decided to prioritize the workloads that deliver the strongest business value, and then focus on each opportunity, focus on each use case in turn, to explore improvements. Now, when I say focus on each in turn, we're not necessarily talking about one at a time, but you would have a team looking at each. And so we could have multiple streams of work going on in parallel in that kind of approach. But where we did it with this customer, you start with one specific data set, take a slice of the data, move it, prove out the value, prove how it works. And that was a really good way in that case for that team to learn alongside us, and to see how they could kind of support that use case ongoing into the future. The other thing in that scenario is that we had the two systems coexist, and expect the two systems to coexist at least for a period. So we're not expecting to turn it off all in one go, kind of 6 weeks after we start in that scenario. You still want to turn it off within a few years probably, and there are different drivers for the timelines for that. But you can allow the systems to coexist, at least to some extent. So we'll talk then about some of the key factors in how you come up with a plan beyond the high-level approach. So once you've decided on your high-level approach, you either try and move everything exactly as it is, like Client A, sometimes referred to as lift and shift, or you could take a more kind of innovation-focused approach, like Client B. You can kind of blend the two to an extent, migrate some things as is and identify other areas where you want to make some changes and innovate, of course. But once you've identified your general approach, you need to start thinking about some of the different things that will affect the plan within that, and how you plan on it kind of to a lower level, more detailed level. So in Thorogood, we like to use these kind of 4 pillars across a lot of our activities for when we're planning, whether it's a migration or whether you're planning your organization structure for analytics, or your approach to an analytics strategy. We like to look at things in terms of people, data, tools, and process. And I think that's helpful here. Again, there are different factors that fall into those categories. So within people, you'll have different groups of stakeholders across the organization in various different roles. When it comes to data, you need to think about existing data sets, new data sets you want, and also things like historical data migration. How do we pull across the data that we have historically, while also thinking about loading the updated data in going forward, and the different approaches to that. So how much history do we want to keep? That will affect the plan. Are there changes that we want to make to it, and add new aspects to the data that will change the plan? Tools, whatever you do, even if you're just lifting it onto a new platform, there's going to be some level of change management with the users. If you're looking at a more innovative approach, quite often there'll be some level of user training needed. You also need to think about upstream and downstream systems. At the very least, there's going to be a change to the connections. But again, the more you're innovating and you making the most of the cloud technologies, the more the chance that there is going to have to be some change to the upstream or the downstream systems, or at least a consideration in the plan as to how you handle those. And then in the process, think about your intended governance approach. Who's going to own the platform? Who takes responsibility for certain different aspects of it? How do you decide exactly what gets deployed? What are the conventions, the naming conventions, the security conventions? you need to think about your testing approach, whatever the migration is. We talked about client A. Our strategy was test, test, test. Also with client B, we needed to do a lot of testing to make sure that the new replacement system is going to deliver the same as the older system. Even if the two are running side by side, that gives us a little bit of comfort, but we still need to do the requisite level of testing to know that the two are going to be the same. And then what does that cutover look like? So when you're switching from system A to system B, is it one switch in one go? Do you move some users first, kind of a pilot group of users and another group of users? There are things in the plan to think about how you do that cutover, how sharp it is, how you can mitigate and minimize some of the risks within that. So going back to these client examples, client A, this is a very high level version of the plan that we had with them. So we did do a workshop with the business. We understood what is it the platform's doing, what is it delivering. I always think it's really important in these data systems, even if you think you're just moving it from a technical perspective, you want to understand people's usage patterns, what data they're using, how they're using it, so that we know how this is going to affect them. And then from there, the analysis really was doing more of the technical aspects around setting up and testing connectivity to the different systems. We might be moving the data platform, but we're still going to connect to the same systems that are feeding that, whether those are on-prem or in this case, they were external sources. So we needed to check the connection to those. And then a very simple kind of base test of the migration approach. So testing for kind of one table in the database. If we move it this way, everything works the way we expect it to, or a small bunch of tables. And then the bigger migration and testing piece, the bulk of the development work, if you like, migrating and then implementing any required changes. Obviously, in this case, we're trying to keep those to an absolute minimum. It depends. Sometimes you want to make some changes and allow different levels of flexibility. System testing and basic performance testing to the system testing, making sure everything runs end to end and making sure that the data is identical in both systems. In this case, was key there. And then for documentation, we will document the server setup and connectivity details, and we documented anywhere that we had made I think there were a couple of changes just due to the way the infrastructure was set up. There were one or two changes, and we made sure that those are well captioned, well documented, so that anything that's changing is spotted there. So what did we achieve? What was our success in this one? We migrated the existing solution to the cloud infrastructure in line with the goals and in line with the plan. We delivered to the very tight timelines. So that 6-week move, we were able to plan everything, migrate everything, test everything very quickly. I think the office move was postponed by 2 weeks, and I think we used that for extra testing, not because we weren't finished, but because we wanted that extra level of security with the client as well. And then all of that testing was happening like for like. The old system has to match the new system exactly. And finally, this gave great continuity for the business users. They're having to go through the office move as well and move all of their stuff from one location to another. The business wants as little downtime as possible. So by having the two systems match exactly, we give great continuity. Whether it's management in their weekly management meetings that just continued uninterrupted, or whether it's the salespeople who are going out to retailers, able to see exactly what the customer behavior patterns are, able to work pretty perfectly between going into one office one day and going into the other office as soon as it opened, and use those reports from day one. Example B then. So if we take the client B example, this isn't the exact pattern that they use. This isn't the exact plan. I've borrowed this as a starting point that we would take on a number of other projects, and haven't filled all the steps in because they're going to be different for each client. And in this scenario, there is more planning work to be done in terms of deciding what priority different activities take, and likely those priorities and to an extent the plan will change and flex as you go through. So there are aspects of initiation that will always have to take place: getting the project set up, planning which priorities different projects, different solutions in the platform take. Then requirements and analysis for each individual project within that, or for each individual, whether it's a report or a data set, you want to do the requirements and analysis on it, design it, build out those components, test and deploy it, and then learn from that, so that when you do the next block of reporting or the next block of data sets, you're taking those learnings into that as well, doing the requirements and analysis, design, build, testing and deployment. At some point, you want to set a kind of wash-up period where you do kind of sign off of everything that's been deployed up to that point, a kind of interim review. Not that the platform is locked and nothing new will ever be added. That point is almost never reached, but there will be a stage when you can kind of sign off and say, okay, so we've moved across everything from the old platform. that we need to move across to the new platform, or at least there'll be a stage when you need to sign off and say, what are we doing about the things that haven't been migrated across yet? Are those things that we're not actually using, or can we move those across in some other way? So plan a wash-up period at some point, even if that feels like it's kind of midway through, still building out more aspects of your data platform. And an aspect that we captured in this around prioritization, project board for change management, and some of the different things that they need. Governance is really important in a project like this, just because of the way there's more going on, there's more prioritization in this. So yeah, just to kind of highlight again the structure that this takes. Typically, you'll separate it out into blocks or applications, or call it a report, call it a data set, whichever way it makes sense to slice the platform into smaller pieces so that it's in coherent units that you can design, build, test, and deploy, and work with the business unit on each of those. Because remember, what we're trying to do here is have more innovation, so that rather than just moving the same data set with the same reports onto the new system, we're going to take more of a look at it and say, well, what are the things that we would add to this data set if we were to rebuild it now? What are the things we would do differently in the report? Is it giving us the tracking that we need? Do we need to make the report more interactive? There's all sorts of things you can do as you migrate that will add extra value to business. And so all of this typically does lead to a longer process. None of these are hard and fast rules, but you'll find that this is usually a longer process, certainly longer than the 6 weeks. But it can deliver earlier incremental delivery of value. So by doing it kind of piece by piece, with each piece you're delivering, you're giving more business value back to the organization. And working with the business owners as part of that is key, so that where a lift and shift gave us the advantage of moving to the cloud from a technical perspective, this kind of innovative approach also adds to the delivery on the specific business goals. And so there's a kind of double win there in terms of the value that's being added. Like I say, one thing to think about is the end date for the legacy system and how you do your kind of wash-up activity and get into that end point. There'll be different drivers for different organizations on exactly what that date is, whether it's that you just kind of got past you've got kind of the critical mass of activities happening on the new platform, then it's time to just move those last couple of things across. Sometimes it's driven by licensing costs. We've seen that a few times, or legacy software being end dated, or support ending for some products. So there can be different drivers in different organizations again, but you will want to think about what the end date is for your platform. So I've covered a few aspects there. There's a lot more that you can take into account, that you should take into account as you craft a plan based on your priorities. So we'll have thought through all of these things as we're approaching each of these projects. It's very hard to talk about how each of these went into each of those plans, but these are some of the things that we think through in doing that. So what are the systems and applications involved? The technical migration aspects, what are we doing from a technology perspective, and what's staying the same, what's changing? What we have to do to move the data across and the reports. So are we changing report technology, right? In some cases, we'll move to a cloud platform, but still be using the same visualization tool, whether it's Tableau, Power BI, any of the other front-end tools that we have. You can still have those pointed at your cloud sources, right? So are your reports going to change as well? Or are you trying to use the same reporting tools to develop essentially the same reports, but on a new platform? So that'll change how you plan it. What are you doing in terms of user enablement? Are your users going to be trained up in some of the new tools that are available now that you move into the cloud platform? And how do users make use of, for example, some of the data science tools that are available so that they can do some exploration on their own from that perspective? And then the more planning focused aspects of it, I guess at the bottom, timeline. So timeline's a key thing to think about, obviously, in any plan, but sometimes that's a bigger driver. Sometimes the timeline will be driven by what your other goals are. Team structure, are you limited to using the structure that's within your current team? Do you need to think about who the owners are for different aspects? How do, for example, business users work with the technical data teams? And are you bringing in suppliers from outside? So very often, if Thorogood is working with the organization, we think about how we fit into that team structure and how we work with people at the client organization in delivering this. What's the overall development approach? Waterfall and agile is two kind of extremes of that. Quite often these projects will fall somewhere in between. There'll be some level of planning up front. That can be larger or smaller depending on how tied down you want to be with your platform. But very often there'll be some level of iteration in the middle of that approach. Project governance: who owns it? Who's signing off on things? Who manages changes? who's managing the budget, who's managing the timeline, all of those aspects, really important to think about. And last but not least, what are we doing in terms of risk mitigation? I've mentioned testing quite a bit on this call. So I think it should be obvious where the risk mitigation aspect has to come into a migration project. So think about what your risk mitigation is. Is that all focused on very thorough testing? Is it a mixture of thorough testing coupled with still keeping access to the old system for a period of time? And if you're doing that, how do you move people across onto the new system and do that kind of change management piece? So I've given you a few things to think about. What I would suggest is if you want to go into that in more detail, a really good way to do that, there's a series of workshops that we've come up with at Thorogood to go through what we call the path to the modern data platform, which really is looking at how to move a data platform onto the cloud. And this is probably focused more on the innovation pattern more than the straight lift and shift migration. But it can be a great starting point for either. We start with an initiation workshop, if I can read it. We start with an initiation workshop and work with the key stakeholders to figure out what the key aims are, like we talked about at the start. Figure out which are the use cases which are going to prove value, the business priorities, and then figure out who the owners and stakeholders need to be for those, so that we can then get into proof of value and show what that development looks like, show what it delivers in that next period. And that, you've kind of said 4 to 6 weeks, depends on the organization, depends on the use case, depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. But deliver that proof of value, learn from that, and take that into a strategy workshop that you can then use to prioritize all of the other use cases and go into a longer piece of phased delivery. I have more content that I'm happy to talk through. We can, if you're interested, reach out to me. We can jump on a call and go through some of the different things that we can do to help with this. But those different sessions, there's a set of inputs, a set of outputs, and the steps that we expect to take in each of those phases. And we can do that. That gives us a structured starting point. We're always going to tailor it to every client and tailor it to the specific needs. But we have a really good starting point that helps frame some of those early conversations to get started on this. With that, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. I do hope to hear from you shortly, and certainly we'll be in touch about some of our future events as well. So thank you for joining.